I'm here with William and Darren, who are accessibility specialists, and I have a couple of questions to ask you guys before we move on into our learning journey. So the first one might be a little weird, but do I need to make my website or app speak to blind people? Do I have to manually add that in?
Right. No, you don't. But that is a common question I often hear from an engineer that's just getting into accessibility. But you do not have to make your website or app speak because we have very powerful screen reading technology built into our computers, our mobile phones, and even our TVs today. So what you need to do as an engineer is just do your code so that your app or website works properly with these tools.
Right, but what about images then? How does that work?
Right.
So images are an interesting case because if you're using a screen reader and you can't see the screen, images are obviously going to be a problem. So for now, while AI is powerful, it is not good enough to really understand what the content of an image is. We have the concept of alternative text, which we provide as authors. If I create a blog post, for example, and I post an image on my blog post, I provide a description of what that image is. And then when Darren visits the blog post, he will get the information that I put inside of the image. It doesn't appear for everyone. It only appears for screen reader users. But that's how I can convey as an author the content that I want my image to say to a screen reader user.
Right.
So you've mentioned a couple of the powerful tools that we have to work with accessibility. Are those tools hard to learn how to use them?
It's not difficult, but it does take some time. You can get started and just turn on one of these screen readers that I mentioned that are built into our devices today. But you won't be an expert, but you can learn relatively quickly. There are dozens of keystrokes you might want to learn to use when you're using a keyboard as a screen reader user or the touch screen on your mobile phone. There are some gestures you need to learn. So there is a bit of a learning curve, but you can learn it relatively quickly. And as an engineer like yourself, you don't need to be an expert per se. You just need to understand the basics so that when you're building, having it in mind, then this better work with a screen reader. Let me check that out.
Gotcha. And is it hard to implement those changes into an website or an app to make it compatible with the tools we need to use?
Right. No, so it's not. It's not hard to do. It is something that requires a concerted effort to do and an understanding of what you're doing. But the way that screen readers work is they will just integrate with the code that is already there. So for example, on the web, we use HTML. And HTML includes the ability for you to make something to be accessible with assistive technology. And we're talking about more than just screen readers here. We're talking about all the different types of assistive technology. And so back to your first question, do I need to make my website speak? Well, no. And also, that's not the only thing you're worried about, right? You need to make it work with other assistive technologies as well. So the way this works is there are an interface that you can use when you create content. HTML is on the web. And then on mobile, there are similar APIs that you can use, the platform interfaces that you can use. And what you're doing is when you create content, you're really entering into a contract with the platform that you're creating it on. And the platform will make your content accessible as long as you give it the information that it needs. And so it's a matter of reading the documentation, figuring out what all of those things are that, the tendency is, I want to make something look good. I want to make it work the way that I think it should work. And, there's all this stuff in the documentation about security and privacy and accessibility and things like that. But I can skip that because it's not, I don't see the benefits of that. Right. So you have to be a holistic engineer, understand what all of those things are, cross your T's and dot your I's in the code. But it's not something that needs to be reinvented. This all already works. It's all been solved before.
It's not necessarily simple, but it's pretty straightforward once you get into it.
And you mentioned things like alternative text. So what are some of the other main issues when it comes to accessibility that we should be paying more attention to?
Right. The issues of accessibility and usability that I come across these days they run the gamut of everything on your website or app from top to bottom, left to right. But some of the main things I see are labeling issues a lot. I had an engineer I was working with at Yahoo that he had a profile tab on his app, and Darren said, I need to label these things, I better label it. So he labeled it, but he labeled it as it looked, not what it was going to do for me. What's that tab going to do when I activate it? He labeled it Navigation Snowman, because that's what we had as the little human profile icon. So he was trying to label it with what it looks like, not what it does. Mm-hmm. So another similar one with buttons in general is they need labels, and they're often just not labeled. So I come across that button and it says button, or a series of buttons, button, button, button. That really makes me happy. So they need labels, and again, they need to convey what that button does. So a good example of that these days is a search button. A search button looks like a magnifying glass. So I'll come across it and I will hear magnifying glass button. Well, that's not what I don't want to know what it looks like. What does it do? So it should say search, right? So that's one of the labeling in general of icons is a very important part of making an app accessible, and things that I come across a lot. Another real common one these days, and very important one, are form fields, right? So every time you download a new app or go to a website you like, maybe you might have to register as a user or start an account, and that involves a form field. So a lot of times I'll come to the form field and I get to that first field and I get into it and it says edit field blank. Okay, that tells me it's an edit field and it's blank. There's nothing in it yet, but what do I enter into it? So it needs to say first name, right? And I type my name and I tab to the next field. It should say last name. And often those aren't labeled, and that's one of the more frustrating things that I can come across these days.
Right. So once you actually put in the effort to implement all those accessibility changes, how can you make sure that it actually works?
Wow, really good question. So we talked about learning the basics of using a screen reader. So you want to just test your app as you're building it. Is it working with the screen reader on my phone? And one of the cool tools you can do today is that you can turn off the screen on your computer or your phone and try to use it with a screen reader. And if you can succeed as well with the screen off using a screen reader as you can when you can see it, then you've succeeded.
Correct. That's a great way to get started. But earlier in the process, as you're doing your coding work, you can actually, there are a lot of tools that can help write code that's going to be more accessible from the start. And these are generally called automated scanners. And there are a lot of different things that you can do, a lot of them for different platforms. But what these will do is they'll scan your code and provide you with a list of issues of what it knows to look for. So we've been talking about labeling and alt tags. And by the way, there's much more to it than just those
right,
two
yeah,
things.
There's a lot of things.
But what it will do is it'll be like, okay, so I found this image on the page and there's no alt text here. That's probably a problem. And so it'll let you know. Or I found this edit text and there's no labels on it, like Darren was talking about. And so it'll tell us, it'll provide a list of reports that says, these are problems. But what it can't do is tell you what that alt text should be or what that label should be. That requires a human to really understand, again, going back to intent. What is this supposed to do? That is so important.
Right.
And these automated tools are getting better. AI is great, and we are looking forward to the day when a machine can fix all of these problems for us.
Right.
But we're not there yet.
We're not there yet. We still have to rely on the old school human being. And that's one thing you can do also is bring in real people with disabilities that use assistive technology to give their opinion of how you're doing on your app.
Right. So when it comes to getting actually started, what's the first step?
Yeah. So we are trying to build a holistic engineer, a holistic designer, somebody that understands what to do, but why to do it. And so in our experience, the best way to do that is to start with the user-focused approach of what is assistive technology and how does it work. And we have, starting with some of the basic assistive technology, like a keyboard. Yeah. So if you're using a laptop or you've got a desktop and you're watching this, then you can just set your mouse aside and use the keyboard by itself. And that will provide you with an experience that many people have. And so go try it. don't use your mouse, but try to navigate a website and see what issues you encounter. So we'll start there, and then we'll build from there. We will go into using a screen reader, not to be an expert like Darren is, but the basics of what you need to do. So when you can go through a web page and you encounter these buttons, you encounter these labeling issues, you kind of understand, okay, this is a problem and I know why it's a problem. And that helps avoid these problems like Darren was saying, I know this needs to have a label, I'm just going to put a label on it.
Right.
And then, the automated scan says I'm good.
Succeeded.
But, it's not usable.
Right.
So we start with the assistive technology itself, understanding where users are coming from, and then we'll start building on the technical bits after that. We'll start with HTML, how to write a good web page, and move into the other things as well. And build considerations from there. So there's a lot to learn, a lot to go into, but we'll build up to that so that anytime that you're encounter a problem or need to come up with a solution, we want you to be able to think how a user thinks and come up with a solution that you can justify. As opposed to checking a box.
So learn why you're doing it and then learn how you're doing it.
Exciting stuff. Let's get started.